God intended from the beginning fully to express himself in the Son, in the incarnation, and thereby bring creation to its fulfillment.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the senior publishing director at Word on Fire. We talk a lot about the Thomistic tradition following Thomas Aquinas. Many of us know about that. Word on Fire promotes it. But what about the Franciscan intellectual tradition? Who are some of the great Franciscan theologians and philosophers, and what can they teach us today? That's our topic for discussion with Bishop Robert Barron, who joins us from Rochester, Minnesota. Bishop, always good to see you.
Hey, Brandon, good to see you.
Before we get to the main topic, I want to share about a very exciting update from Word on Fire, and that's the introduction of a new fellowship inside of our Word on Fire Institute called the Venerable Jerome Lejeune Fellowship. Who was Jerome Lejeune? And then maybe say a word about the gentleman who has stepped into this new role, Mark Bradford, who we're all very excited about.
Yeah, Jerome Lejeune was an important player in the 20th century. He dies, in the 1990s, I think, Brandon. He was a friend of John Paul II. Physician who did a lot of groundbreaking work in understanding the sources of Down syndrome. But more than that, he was a very committed Catholic and wanted to reach out in love and support to those who were marked by this condition, So he stands as a very important, I think, prophetic figure today when so many people are just willing to eliminate those with Down syndrome. And so we founded and established this fellowship to really be a strong pro-life statement, and very proud to name it for him.
And again, Mark Bradford is the gentleman who has taken up on this role. He was the founding president of the Jerome Lejeune Foundation in the United States, long held a deep admiration for Mr. Lejeune. The purpose of this fellowship is especially to acknowledge and help those with developmental and intellectual disabilities, provide resources for them. And then I think, Bishop, tell me if this is correct, we're planning to open up another position soon, hoping to hire someone with an intellectual or developmental disability to help in this task.
That's the plan, yeah. And Mark is a wonderful guy. I just met him for the first time after he was appointed. I knew about him, but I met him for the first time a few weeks ago. And very impressive gentleman with a very rich background in education, advocacy, and so on. So he'll be a marvelous figure, I hope, on the public stage, advocating for those with Down syndrome. Because to me, it's one of the really negative marks of our society today, people's willingness just to, brush aside, to eliminate those who, might pose some difficulties for their parents or for the society. The church has got to stand for something better than that.
I mean, you see the same headlines I do, but in some of the Nordic countries and in Europe, they'll proclaim, we've eliminated Down syndrome. There's only like a
by
handful
eliminating
of...
all those with Down syndrome.
Precisely,
right.
Precisely.
It's barbaric, and we have to stand strongly against it.
Okay, let's turn to the Franciscans, the Franciscan intellectual tradition. Now, when most of us think of the Franciscans, the followers of St. Francis of Assisi, we think of their great pastoral ministry, their care for the poor, for the environment, their prayer, their preaching. But they also have a very rich and interesting intellectual tradition. Tell us about that. And also, why do you think it's become somewhat eclipsed? Why don't we hear much about it today?
Well, it's a very interesting set of questions there, Brandon. You're right about the Franciscans, going back to Francis himself, who was not an intellectual. Francis was not a writer, not a philosophically minded person. Had enormous, charismatic gifts, but in other directions. Nevertheless, the Franciscan movement emerges precisely at the time when the great universities were emerging. Think Bologna and Paris and Oxford and others. And so very quickly within the Franciscan history, an intellectual tradition develops, and Franciscan friars find themselves at these great universities. So, the famous example being St. Bonaventure, who was a good friend of St. Thomas Aquinas. The two of them together taught at the University of Paris. And so we're within a short time of the life of Francis himself, but the Franciscans got involved. And with a particular flavor, there is indeed a lot of Francis in their intellectual tradition, even though Francis himself was not an academic. But I've always found that fascinating.
Well, I'd like to focus on two of the giants of this Franciscan intellectual tradition. We could probably, as you say, do a whole course, looking at 5, 10, 15 of them. The two I'd like to focus on, though, are Bonaventure and John Duns Scotus. So let's start with Bonaventure. As you say, almost an exact contemporary of Thomas Aquinas, born in 1221, so just 4 years before Thomas Aquinas.
Older,
but dies the same year, 1274. So their lifetimes overlapped almost exactly.
Yeah.
Tell us about St. Bonaventure. Who was he?
Oh, he's a fascinating figure, as you say, a little older than Thomas Aquinas. If we go to the end of his life, right, he dies at the Council of Lyon. Thomas died on the way to the Council of Lyon. It's an interesting moment in church history, the two greatest intellects of that time. And they were summoned by the Pope to deal with the East-West split, which has been bedeviling the church for a couple of centuries. And sadly, ironically, the two great intellectuals die basically at the Council of Lyon. But Bonaventure joins the Franciscans as a young man and enters into their intellectual life. Along with Aquinas, as a very young man, he becomes a magister, we'd say a professor of theology at the University of Paris. And he begins to develop a theology in parallel to Aquinas in some ways. Both are scholastics, and indeed Bonaventure writes in the scholastic Latin and scholastic style, but is very much in the Augustinian, more Platonic tradition, where Aquinas represents the more Aristotelian tradition. So they're like two wings or two lungs, to use John Paul II's language. Bonaventure then becomes the master of the Franciscan order. Very interesting that he's a man of the mind of the academy, but then he also becomes an administrator. In fact, one of the most important people in forming the Franciscan life institutionally. He then goes through, maybe we call it today a midlife crisis or a psychological, spiritual crisis, and he withdraws from that job. And he goes to Mount Alverno, which is associated with St. Francis himself. And there he has himself a kind of mystical experience, which gives rise to his greatest book, which is called the Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, the Mind's Road to God. And that becomes one of the most important texts of the Middle Ages. And as we say, he died then in 1274. So it's a fairly young man. I mean, Thomas is probably 49 when he dies, and Bonaventure maybe in his mid-50s. But a massively influential character.
Let's talk about that book you just alluded to, The Mind's Road to God, sometimes translated The Journey of the Mind to God.
Yeah.
Probably his most classic text, the book he's best known for. What does he lay out in this book?
Well, just that, the itinerarium. How do you get to God? What's the journey? And the famous move of Bonaventure is, I call it out, in, up. So the first move is to go out. You go out to the natural world. Now think how Franciscan this is. Francis in the fields around Assisi, the kind of love for nature and love for the birds and for the animals. Well, that's a first instinct in looking for God. We look at the beauty and the intelligibility of the natural order. So we go out. The second move is to go in. And what do I find when I go in? But my powers of intellect and will, which are the image of God. See, so he takes it very seriously. That's not just a bland description, but if that's the imago Dei, well, then I'm going to find something of God in my own mind and my own will. And anyway, I followed this path a lot in my own writing and speaking is, what do you find when you look at the mind? Well, the mind wants particular truths, and then it wants more and more and more until it finally wants the source of all truth. The will wants particular goods, but it then goes out to ever higher types of good until it wants goodness itself. And so the journey inward to these two faculties leads to God. And then finally up, which is the mystical move. When I discover God's highest names, one associated with the Old Testament, which is being, right? When Moses says, well, what's your name? And God says, ego sum qui sum. I am who I am. So the God is being itself. Bonaventure agrees with that, of course. That's a legitimate name of God. But then he says there's an even higher name associated more with the New Testament. And this is the name of the good or love. When he says good, he's not using it in the Aristotelian sense. For Aristotle, the good is the desirable. So Thomas will do that. How come God is supremely good? Well, God is supremely desirable, right? But for Bonaventure in the Platonic tradition, the good is that which gives. right? The good, bonum diffusivum sui, we say in that tradition. The good is diffusive of itself. And so God's highest name, beyond the name of being, is the name of love or the good. And so he envisions those two names as like the angels on top of the Ark of the Covenant with their wings touching, the name of being and the name of the good. So it's a beautiful, mystical, academic, scholastic text about how the mind, and when he says mind, mens in his Latin doesn't mean the kind of analytical mind of an engineer. That mens would mean spirit, esprit, the French say, or Geist, the Germans say. Not just the analytical mind, it means the soul, if you want. The soul's itinerarium, and then beautifully in his Latin, in deum, and in with the accusative, in deum, always has a sense of movement toward, of journey into. It's an itinerary in the direction of God, and it's going to be a never-ending, infinitely open-ended search and quest for God. It's a short text, by the way. You can read it easily, maybe in a couple of sittings, and one of the great classics of our tradition.
You mentioned just a moment ago that Bonaventure and Aquinas may have been the two brightest minds in the church of their day, and again, near exact contemporaries. Did they have much interaction with each other? What did they make of each other?
There's a debate about that. Certainly they would have known each other. It'd be hard to imagine both of them operating, at least for a time, together at the University of Paris, both at the highest level of the theological culture of their time. It'd be hard to imagine they didn't. Some say that their friendship was exaggerated, that we kind of made too much of it, like they were bosom buddies. So it's hard to tell. They certainly knew each other. To be honest, they would have been intellectually maybe a bit wary of each other because they were following different paths. Thomas would have been the sort of revolutionary, newfangled Aristotelian, more rationalist, more empirical, more Aristotelian. Bonaventure, in a way, stood for an older tradition that was more Platonic and Augustinian. So it's very interesting. I might have mentioned this, Brandon, before, but Paul Tillich, the 20th century Protestant theologian, once described his work this way. He said, I'm picking up the banner that Bonaventure dropped in the dusty streets of Paris in the 13th century, because Tillich saw a kind of triumphant Thomism, right, took the banner. But the Platonic Augustinian tradition, represented by Bonaventure, had been kind of dropped. And Tillich, and this is an interesting way to look at his own theology, saw he was trying to recover that more mystical Platonic approach. So how they knew each other, I'd say they certainly did. They're both saints of the church. Were they bosom buddies? I don't know. Were they on the same intellectual path? Clearly not, There's a famous story, it could be a legend, who knows, but it's a lovely story of Aquinas going to visit Bonaventure and asking, what's the key to your knowledge? And he pulled back a curtain to reveal the cross, And I think that'd be true of Thomas too, that Thomas, they say, would spend hours in front of the Blessed Sacrament with his head resting on the tabernacle. So I think they're both great saints of the church who knew the scholastic method very well, but both of whom drew their inspiration finally from prayer.
Hearing you talk about Paul Tillich reminds me of another 20th century theologian who was doing something similar, trying to recapture the Augustinian Bonaventure tradition, and that's the young Joseph Ratzinger.
Yeah,
so he did his professorial dissertation on Bonaventure, the theology of history in Bonaventure. Do you see him trying to recover Bonaventure in similar ways?
Yes, absolutely. And see, keep in mind, it's an interesting thing, Brandon, that go back to Ratzinger's time. So he's a young man studying theology in the 40s. There was such a dominance of a sort of neo-scholasticism at that time when Catholic theology meant that you did it in this Thomistic framework and frankly, in a somewhat ossified form of Thomism. And so a lot of the best and brightest, and I include here Ratzinger, de Lubac, certainly von Balthasar, a lot of the best and brightest rebelled against that. And not that they hated Aquinas, they didn't, but they didn't like the sort of straitjacket that the neo-scholastic movement put them into. And they found more lyrical these texts from the church fathers from Augustine, and then the medieval version of that would be Bonaventure. And so, right, they saw him as a way of kind of wriggling free of an intellectual straitjacket. Now, all the people I mentioned, look, de Lubac writes major texts on Thomas Aquinas. Ratzinger, I have great reverence for Thomas Aquinas, but I think they saw Bonaventure as a way forward or a fresh vision and perspective. So that's exactly right. Tillich and Ratzinger are similar that way.
Let's move to a second intellectual giant in the Franciscan tradition. That's John Duns Scotus. Scotus was born about 40 years after Aquinas and Bonaventure, so he's kind of the next generation after those two. If I can recommend, there's an excellent new book on Duns Scotus that I just received and read by Thomas Ward titled Ordered by Love, an introduction to John Duns Scotus. Shout out to my friend Killian Lansing, who's a teacher down here in Miami, who graciously sent me a copy of that book. Give us a little introduction to Duns Scotus. And when you do, Bishop, I know, because I've heard this from many people, common question I hear, why does Bishop Barron hate John Duns Scotus? So maybe answer that question along there.
Yeah, I don't at all. I mean, I quarrel with one aspect, which is his take on univocity of being. But I don't hate him by any means. I think he's one of the great figures in our tradition. As you say, generation after Aquinas and company, though he doesn't live very long. He dies, I think, at the age of about 42. He dies in, I believe, 1305. Is that right?
1308, I think.
1308. So, he doesn't live that much longer. After Aquinas dies 1274, Scotus dies 1308. Scotus, was he Irish? Was he Scottish? That name could mean both those things. His name was John Duns, right? Scotus would be naming is where he's from, So John Duns, the Irishman, or John Duns, the Scotsman, studies at Oxford as a young man. He becomes a Franciscan, so he's in the Franciscan order and that tradition. Oxford becomes his city in a way that Paris became Thomas's city. He's known as the subtle doctor, the doctor subtilis. Thomas is the doctor angelicus, right? The angelic doctor. And you see why when you read Scotus, that he's extremely dense in the scholastic mode. But Aquinas writes in a way in a very simple Latin, in a very straightforward Latin. His ideas are complex, to be sure, but Thomas's literary style is almost naive. It's sort of a naively straightforward way of writing. Scotus, it's an extremely dense style. It's like the scholastic method almost reaching a Baroque sort of expression, if you know what I mean by that. When it reaches a type of complexity and density. But I think anyone that reads him admires that quality in him. He's Oxford for a time, then he goes to the continent, and he's in Paris for a time, but he dies in Cologne. And I literally stumbled on his grave. This is several years ago. We were filming over in Cologne. And you go to what's called the Minoritenkirche, the Church of the Friars Minor, right? The Franciscan church, not far from the great cathedral of Cologne, on the site of which Thomas Aquinas had been ordained. And at the time, everything would have been pretty close together. So there was the Franciscan church, and you go up, I believe it was like a side aisle, and there is this sarcophagus, and it's the tomb of Duns Scotus. And I remember being extremely moved by that I literally stumbled upon him, and to think here's one of the masterminds of really the whole Western tradition, certainly of the Middle Ages. And he made contributions in very significant areas of philosophy and theology. As we say, dies in 1308. It's a little sketch of John Duns. We don't really know that much about him. We have a little kind of sketchy sense of Scotus's life.
Let's talk about a couple of his key contributions. One of them was his focus on what we might call particularity, emphasizing the unique individual aspects of each created being over the general form. What's he driving at here, and why is that idea important?
Yeah, and again, for those who think I don't like Duns Scotus, I love this idea of haec seitas. I think it's a real step forward. So he coins that term, haec seitas, which means thisness, if you want. Hic, hoc. Haec is this. Haec seitas, thisness. Now, here's what he's driving at, Brandon, if I can say it kind of simply, is in so much of classical epistemology, the goal of knowing tends to be an abstraction. So I see you, for example, right? And then in classical epistemology from Aristotle and Aquinas, I would abstract a form, namely your humanitas, from the phantasm. That means from the image that I hold in my mind. I abstract the form from the phantasm, and then the agent intellect places that on the passive intellect, which then returns for verification to the phantasm. But the terminus ad quem of this whole process is the form. Now, what I'm saying is that knowing in this classical Aristotelian framework seems to be about coming to an abstraction and leaving behind, if you want, what makes you particular, right? Scotus, I think quite correctly, said, yeah, the mind does want to know abstractions like humanitas, but also it wants to know you. It wants to know Brandon Vaught. Now, how does the Aristotelian tradition handle this? Well, it would say, you, like me, have humanitas. We share that form in common, but your humanitas is instantiated by a particular matter. Mine's instantiated by a different matter, and that's what accounts for our individuality and our separateness. Well, Scotus and others thought, is that adequate? Is that an adequate way to account for what makes you, you? So I get it. We're both human beings. We have the form of humanitas. I get it. My mind understands that. But when I say, oh, I know Brandon Vaught, I know Brandon, well, am I saying more than, oh yeah, I know the particular matter that instantiates the form? You know, there's something about you that's particular and that the mind seeks to know. There's a form of particularity. Now, for an Aristotelian, that sounds contradictory, but I think Scotus is onto something of great moment there. And as many point out, it's born of a Franciscan feel for the particular, right? That Francis, again, with the birds and with the animals and with the fields and with nature, there's a love for the particular that is now given articulate philosophical expression by the introduction of this new term, haixeitas. So to all those who think I don't like Scotus, I love that idea. I think it's a great leap forward in epistemology.
You know, today Duns Scotus is maybe best remembered for his defense of the Immaculate Conception of Mary.
Yeah.
At the time, in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of debate over this question. In fact, Thomas Aquinas famously sided with those who denied the doctrine, or at least didn't want to profess it. But Duns Scotus held fast to it and was eventually vindicated when the doctrine was declared a dogma in 1854. But instead of focusing on that particular aspect of his theology, I want to ask you about a second great idea, which is his understanding of the incarnation, particularly the motivation for the incarnation.
Right.
According to Scotus, why did Christ become man?
Can I say just a quick word, though, Brandon, about the Immaculate Conception? First of all, but yeah, Scotus got that one right. The Aquinas did not hold to the Immaculate Conception. And when they were contemplating defining this, you know, in the 19th century, Dominicans went to Sopra Minerva in Rome to pray that it not happen, and because their great master said it wasn't true. So Scotus was right about that, and I'll give him full credit. And his famous typically scholastic adage is potuit, decuit, fecit, which means, in regard to God, he could do it. It was fitting that he do it. Therefore, he did it. Potuit, decuit, fecit. And that's his pithy argument for the Immaculate Conception. God could do this. He could preserve Mary from original sin. It was appropriate that he would do so, decuit. Therefore, he did it, fecit. Good argument, you know. So he's right about that, and I give him full credit. The incarnation, it's a very important thing, Brandon. And, you know, this is, again, one of these famous dichotomies in theology. They say whether you're a Thomist or you're a Scotist when it comes to soteriology and incarnational theology. To state it simply, you're a Thomist if you say the purpose of the incarnation was to save us from sin. And so it's the Felix Culpa tradition, right? Oh, happy fault. It's because of the sin of Adam that God then said, I'm going to send my son so as to die a redeeming death and to save people from sin. So the sort of sanative, curative quality of the incarnation. Where Scotus, without denying that dimension of it, would say, even if we had never sinned, God would still send his son and the incarnation would still happen. Now, why? So as fully to display his glory in the fulfillment of creation. Now, it's very interesting, Brandon, here, because Aquinas is following a more Augustinian tradition here, right, that puts a stress on sin and redemption. Where Scotus is going back to a more Irenaean tradition, and before Irenaeus to Paul. So think of Irenaeus, with the recapitulation of all things, anakephaleiosis, he would have called it, the coming together of all things, summing up creation under the headship of Christ. Would that have happened even if we hadn't sinned? Yeah, sure it would. Because God intended from the beginning fully to express himself in the Son, in the incarnation, and thereby bring creation to its fulfillment. Now, I want to be careful, because I think this is largely a question more of emphasis rather than dichotomy, because you do have that more Irenaean strain in Aquinas. You do have the sanative, curative thing in Duns Scotus. But I think it's fair to say there's a difference in emphasis. And Scotus, I love on this theme. I think we've missed a lot when we simply follow the Augustinian Thomist line, that the incarnation is there to handle the problem of sin. It can be just too restrictive and too almost legalistic an understanding of the incarnation. Where Scotus has this lyrical, mystical understanding of it. And there's something kind of lovely and beautiful in the incarnation and not just curative. So again, if people think I don't like Scotus, on the contrary, I think that's a wonderful idea, that he recoups it from the Pauline Irenaean tradition, but brings it to very rich expression in the Middle Ages. And then it's carried forward by the Franciscan intellectual tradition very beautifully.
I just realized I didn't highlight exactly why people think you don't like Duns Scotus, and we probably don't have time to get into the weeds here. Basically, you're not a big fan of Scotus's idea of the univocity of being, as opposed to Aquinas's analogical view of being. Again, maybe we'll do a future episode on that. Yeah. I don't want to open up that Pandora's box right now. It's
complicated, yeah. But that's when my quarrel with Scotus. I think he was wrong about that, and I think mischief was worked by that, largely under the influence of his later successor, William of Ockham, another one in the Franciscan tradition, but I think ran with Scotus's univocity in a way that led to much of modernity's trouble with the way we understand God. So right, that part of Scotus I would be more hesitant about.
But let me close with this question. We've hinted throughout this episode of this tension, this divide between the Thomists, the followers of Thomas Aquinas, and the Franciscans, the followers of Francis. And although this divide is often exaggerated, as you just alluded to in your most recent answer, let me ask you this. What do you think Thomists can stand to learn from the Franciscan intellectual tradition?
Yeah, the very things we talked about. I think it to fill out the picture. There's a shadow side to everything, right? I mean, Jung taught us that. In fact, the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow, as he said. That whatever we're doing, there's always a sed contra, if I can put it in Thomistic language, right? That whatever I say, well, there's something else that you could also say. To me, the shadow of Thomism, and I'm a Thomist, I'm a proud Thomist, and happy to claim that title. But the shadow of Thomism is a kind of rationalism, I think. Thomas knew correctly in his time this was a needful thing for the church to express itself in this very rigorously intellectual way. And his Aristotelianism was in many ways a step forward. But it carries the shadow of a certain intellectualism, a certain rationalism, an overlooking of the more lyrical elements. I think Thomists can learn from the Franciscan tradition more of that mystical, intuitive side of theology. I think that's exactly what Ratzinger would have emphasized as a young man, and indeed throughout his whole career as a theologian. I think it's what Balthasar brings. And let me say this too, Brandon. There's something very Western about Thomas, and he stands in the Augustinian tradition, brings Aristotle into play. but does it need always something from the East to come in? Well, behind Bonaventure indeed is Augustine, but I think also the Irenaean stream. And to say Irenaeus is to say the East. And I think Thomism could benefit from some of that Eastern influence. Think of Balthasar here, who brings Origen and Maximus the Confessor and those people forward. They felt the perhaps too westernized Augustinian Thomism needed something of the East, to come in. Now, I know all my Thomist friends, and I agree with them on this. Does Thomas use the Eastern Fathers? Yes, he does. Yes, he does. But, are they a more muted influence than, let's say, the Augustinian and Aristotelian? Probably. And I think Thomism could benefit from that influence.
Looking forward to the healthy stream of feedback we'll get from both the Thomists and the Franciscans, both of whom assume that we hate both of them. Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. Today we have a question from Meg. Meg lives in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and she's asking Bishop Barron about God's love. Here's her question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Meg from Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I was wondering if God the Father loves us as much as he loves Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Thank you for all you guys are doing. God bless.
Yeah, it's a cool question, actually, and it's a subtle question. Let me try to make a simple distinction there. Look at God's love more from the subjective side. So God is infinite, and God's name is love. And so whenever God loves, he loves with an infinite love. That's all he is. But I can look at it now objectively. And if to love is to will the good of the other, can I say that God wills more good for some than for others? And that answer is clearly yes. As Cardinal George used to say, let's face it, God loved the Blessed Mother more than he loved Francis George. I mean, he gave the Blessed Mother more gifts and more graces. Does God love an angel more than he loves me? Well, not subjectively from within God's infinite, subjectivity, but objectively, did he give an angel more good than he gave me? Well, sure, of course he did. An angel is at a higher pitch of being. Does the Father love the Son more than he loves me? Well, obviously, yes, that the Father is resting in the infinite goodness of the Son. And that's what it means there to will is good in that sense, that God, the Father, is in the presence of the infinite good of the Son. So objectively, yes, it's a greater love. But it doesn't mean that, God's being kind of difficult and, well, I'm not going to love you and not as much as him. But it's just read objectively, does he will more good for some than for others? The answer, I think, is clearly yes to that.
Well, thanks for your question, Meg. I forgot to mention that if you want to submit a question to Bishop Barron, you can do so at the website askbishopbarron.com. And again, every episode we take one question just like the one Meg asked. Listen, it's an exciting day here at Word on Fire because today marks the launch of Bishop Barron's latest book. It is titled, This Is My Body. A recent Pew Research study revealed that a startling number, 69% of Catholics, do not believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. For the majority of Catholics today, the Eucharist is merely a symbol of Christ. The Mass is merely a collectivity of like-minded individuals gathering to remember his life. Of course, this indicates a spiritual disaster, for the Eucharist is the source and the summit of the Christian life. In response to this crisis, Bishop Barron, along with his brother bishops, began working on a solution. And from these conversations, the National Eucharistic Revival was born. It's a 3-year process. We're right in the middle of it right now. And as a part of that, Bishop Barron has released this new book titled This Is My Body, A Call to Eucharistic Revival, which is designed to accompany this 3-year revival. You can find copies of this book at the website wordonfire.org/Eucharist. And here's the really exciting part. You can get copies for only $2 with free shipping. $2 with free shipping. Bishop, I know is your goal that you want to get these out to hundreds of thousands of parishes and parishioners and all over the country, right?
Yeah, that's the goal. It's a bit like our Letter to a Suffering Church a couple years ago. It's the same kind of format. It's a very, short paperback. And yeah, my hope is that we just get this thing widely distributed.
So go to the website. I'll link to it in the show notes, wordonfire.org/Eucharist. Get 10 copies, 20 copies, 50 copies. Pass them out to everybody you know and help contribute in a significant way to this Eucharistic revival in America. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.